Family and fellow soldiers, I'm the Professor, and this is the Moment of Truth. Today is going to be the first in what will be a 3-part Friday weekly series dealing with reparations and who owes us. This is not going to be a comprehensive list that would take the rest of my life, but we are going to make sure that we mention just a few of the big players in American society who happen to have benefited off of the slave trade and who still benefit from it to the present day. The first thing that must always be remembered is that the United States is a debtor nation, but the white media and the white government are always lying about who this country owes a debt to. We built this country, those of us who are descended from America's slaves, those of us who can trace our ancestry back to the killing fields of the American South. And this den of vipers that has wronged us every moment of every day for 500 years owes us everything. We are this nation's creditors. This country is our debtor. They owe us. This country owes us everything. And we are calling in all those debts. But ever since 1865, there has been a massive creditor-debtor standoff in this country. The deadbeats who owe us have used every means at their sick, demented disposal in their perverted effort to avoid paying what they owe. Well, black empowerment is on the march, and we are here to collect. The question is not who owes. Everyone in this country whose ancestry does not go back to the plantations of the American South owes us, and that includes the Red Indians, not to be confused with the black ones. It doesn't matter if you're an immigrant, even a black immigrant. You came here because you wanted a piece of the world's greatest economy that our ancestors built. You wanted something you didn't create. You knew there was a corrupt cabal of thieves and murderers who would give you a few crumbs if you allied yourselves with them against us. The U.S. is not a country. It is the world's biggest crime scene, the scene of the greatest and worst crime in human history. And not only have the perpetrators of that crime not been brought to justice, the crime is still ongoing to this very moment. There's no question that we're owed, and no question about who owes us. The only question is, who do we start with? Who do we wring our money out of first? That's what this 3-part weekly series is about. It's about giving us just a few of those names. All you have to do is look at the oldest companies in this country, some of the oldest families and even oldest schools in this country, and you'll see a who's who of slave owners and beneficiaries of slavery. Most of them were directly slave owners, and for those who claim not to have personally owned slaves, they usually did business with and benefited directly from those who did. Since we deal with power, wealth, and influence here, you know this series has to start with corporate America. As Jason Black has always said, the strength of white supremacy lies in its economy. Emphasis on the lie part. That's what slavery was all about. That's why they felt they could afford to abandon chattel slavery so long as they locked us out of the economy, which has been what they've done for 150 plus years. So, who do we start with first? The institution whose very name is synonymous with America's economic might. Wall Street. The meter on their debt began running in 1626, when black people were brought as slaves to what today is Manhattan. Slavery became the foundation of New York's wealth and the engine of the American economy. Most people are taught that New York wasn't a slave state because it wasn't in the South. That's a lie. New York had slavery, and during the Civil War, New York was allied with the South, just like Delaware, which Joe Biden loves to brag about until he ran for president. To give you an idea of how widespread the slavery was in New York City, consider this. By 1730, 1 out of every 5 New Yorkers was a slave, and 2 out of every 5 New Yorkers owned slaves. Now, this was over 45 years before the Declaration of Independence was even written, and New York City was already leading the league in slave owners. That means New York City had the second highest number of slave owners per capita in America. That percentage is higher than Atlanta, Baltimore, Birmingham, or even New Orleans. Only Charleston, South Carolina had a higher percentage. The Dutch had set up their little outpost on the southern tip of what today is called Manhattan, and that's where the wall that Wall Street is named after was built, but not by the Dutch. It was built by our ancestors. We literally built Wall Street. We were the ones who cleared the land that today bears names like Broadway. Now, the reason for the wall was to be a fortification against Indian raids, but in truth, it was a defense against the British, who the Dutch were at war with. The Dutch called this little outpost New Amsterdam. However, the Dutch only had a few outposts in the Americas, so the British had them vastly outnumbered and geographically surrounded. The Dutch eventually surrendered their little outpost of New Amsterdam to the British, who renamed it New York. By 1699, the invaders, settlers, felt they had enough numbers now to take land outside of that little fortress. So they deconstructed the wall. Slavery, however, wasn't going anywhere. Under the British, slavery was about to become the biggest, most lucrative industry in New York, and Wall Street would be its epicenter. In 1711, a slave market was built on Wall Street along the Eastern Shore, remaining there until 1762. I want you to think about that. Before Wall Street played host to a number of multinational banking conglomerates and all these captains of industry, hell, before there was even a United States of America, Wall Street was a slave market 65 years before the Declaration of Independence was even written. And the Wall Street slave market was an important generator of taxes for New York City. Now, whenever most people think about Wall Street, the image that almost instantly comes to mind is the New York Stock Exchange building, so we'll start there. The NYSE was founded in 1792. The first shares traded at the NYSE were for the First Bank of the United States. The founder and first president of the First Bank of the United States was a man called Thomas Willing. Thomas Willing was a slave owner, naturally, and he had founded a shipping company with a business partner, Robert Morris. They called their shipping firm Willing, Morris & Company. Their company was involved in the slave trade, which helped make Willing a rich man. He took the proceeds of his dirty business and used it to invest in the fledgling New York Stock Exchange. Also among the very first shares traded at the New York Stock Exchange were for the Bank of North America. Thomas Willing's business partner, Robert Morris, he was the man primarily responsible for financing the start of the Bank of North America. Morris had put a ton of his own money into it, and this helped him to attract outside investors. Robert Morris came from a wealthy family of slave owners, and like his pal Thomas Willing, Morris himself owned at least 2 black people as slaves. This made Robert Morris one of the richest men in pre-revolutionary America, with money made in large part from the slave trade. And these were 2 of the very first shares traded on Wall Street. This was what provided the seed money for the New York Stock Exchange. But as we all know, the word banking means a lot more than just a place to put your money. It also deals with financial instruments too, and this is where insurance companies come in. As the New York Times Magazine reported, New Yorkers invested heavily in the growth of southern plantations, catching the wave of the first cotton boom. Southern planters who wanted to buy more land and black people borrowed funds from New York bankers and protected the value of bought bodies with policies from New York insurance companies. They're talking about insurance companies like New York Life. Originally, the company was named Nautilus Mutual Life Insurance in 1841. In 1849, they changed their name to New York Life, but it's the exact same company. And these weren't small-timers either. As New York Life's own website puts it, their original board of trustees were some of the most influential merchants and captains of industry in the city of New York. Indeed, as the New York Times put it, some of the city's wealthiest merchants, bankers, and railroad magnates. And what was New York Life doing? How did they make their seed money? They began looking south to see if any slave owners would like to insure their human property. In February 1846, one New York Life agent sold over 30 policies in a single day. New York Life clearly wanted to expand their involvement in this dirty business because they immediately began taking out ads in southern newspapers from North Carolina to Kentucky asking if plantation owners wanted to get their slaves insured. Insuring slaves wasn't a new idea, nor was it limited only to North America. The British insurance company Lloyd's of London made their fortune insuring the slave ships and their captives for the better part of 200 years. Taking out insurance policies on them once they were imprisoned on the plantations, however, was something of a novel concept, but one that New York Life made a killing on. Slave policies would come to make up a third of New York Life's business. The president of New York Life, James DePire Ogden, would give a tisk-tisk ascribing the word evil to slavery, but clearly it wasn't evil enough for him to turn any of that money down. Whenever some white supremacist tries to tell you that these slave owners and their business pals felt regret about taking part in slavery, you just remember that none of these guys ever did anything about it. There's been a cottage industry in revisionists and outright liars trying to rewrite the history books, to downplay or even deny the part that all these white captains of industry played in slavery. Amazing how all the rich and powerful white politicians and bankers and financiers and other influential white men all allegedly decried slavery, and yet these rich and powerful white men just couldn't put their heads together and do anything about it. They could, however, help slavery to spread. They could help to reinforce it through legislation. That they could do. So don't ever let anyone take some meaningless slave owner's quote out of context, then add their layer of spin to it and tell you, well, this slave owner, he wasn't as bad as all that. If you truly regret something, then you have to make amends for it. An insincere apology 200 years after the fact is tantamount to a slap in the face. New York Life is a Fortune 100 company, and they built their fortune off the slave trade. If they were sorry, they'd be paying reparations. And New York Life was hardly alone. AIG also has dirty hands. One of AIG's subsidiaries, U.S. Life, sold policies to slave owners, as did Aetna. But of course, the banks were the ones who made the most off of slavery. Citibank, Bank of America, Wells Fargo, and of course J.P. Morgan Chase, they all bought banks whose wealth and assets were made by slavery. Profiteering off of slavery was so lucrative and so attractive that even companies that hadn't started off as banks eagerly wanted to become banks so that they could get a piece of the action too. The now defunct Lehman Brothers is a prime example of that. Lehman Brothers was started by three Jewish siblings, Henry and Emmanuel, who were later joined by their younger sibling, Meyer. Lehman Brothers was started in Alabama as a dry goods store, not a bank. With cotton being king in those days, and considering the South was as backwards then as it is now, the Lehman Brothers wound up having to accept cotton as payment for their merchandise. And just to show you that dealing in slave-grown cotton wasn't some incidental factor for the Lehman Brothers, that it was in fact something that they themselves approved of, we know that at least one of the Lehman Brothers, Meyer Lehman, was recorded in the 1860 census as being the owner of 7 slaves, one as young as 5 years old. That's an important fact to point out. Lehman Brothers didn't just bump elbows with slave owners, they were slave owners. These guys didn't have some passing tangential connection to the slave trade, they were neck deep in it. One of Wall Street's longest standing and most prestigious financial firms was started by a bunch of slave owners. After a while, they thought they spotted an opportunity. They decided to get into the cotton trading business because apparently that's how much cotton they wound up having on hand. Their foray into the commodities market took off and made them rich. They opened a branch office in New York, and they would later completely move their entire operation there, setting up the New York Cotton Exchange in 1870. The Lehman Brothers parlayed their money from trading slave cotton into underwriting upstart companies like Sears Roebuck. They would later go into underwriting bonds for the railroads. But that's another story. One of the most lucrative financial practices by the banks were slave mortgages. You heard me right. Using our ancestors as collateral for banknotes was a very popular practice, and not just among some ham and egger slave owner with 1 or 2 slaves. Thomas Jefferson mortgaged 150 of his slaves so that he could raise the money to build Monticello. Slave owners would frequently take out multiple mortgages on the same slave, thereby increasing how much money they could get their hands on. And if the loan couldn't be paid, well, let the financiers fight amongst themselves to see who takes possession of the slave then. As the Los Angeles Times reported it, how the founders got into debt was simple. Each year, they sold their tobacco to European merchants, mainly British, primarily in exchange for the goods that supported their lavish lifestyles. As tobacco prices fell, but their desire for material comforts remained, they paid for that lifestyle on credit, extended by many of the same merchants. The patricians of July 4th bristled at their independence being clipped by British creditors, and that independence being so deeply predicated on tobacco, their main way of raising the money owed to those creditors. Tobacco was demanding to grow, and without slaves to raise their crops, Jefferson, Washington, and other slave owners would have been far too busy farming to have had the leisure to contemplate the lofty ideals of liberty. In this way, liberty was tied directly to slavery. Although it would be incorrect to say that the founders went to war with Britain just to get out from under debt, their mounting debt predisposed them to be open to the idea of separating from Britain, resulting in the Declaration of Independence and the Revolutionary War. In the years following America's victory in that war, deep debt continued to hang over Jefferson. He sought repayment plans with his European creditors and used his slaves, whom he listed by name, as collateral against that repayment. In this regard, Jefferson was at the leading edge of a blossoming trend. Although tobacco eventually yielded to cotton, an entire financial services industry emerged from slave-backed loans before the Civil War, through what one economic historian called an orgy of bank creation. The international, read European, finance markets also benefited tremendously from slave mortgages. The slave owners would take out a slave mortgage on a number of their slaves, our ancestors, and then package those mortgages together into bonds, which they would then market all over the world, because slave bonds were understood to be one of the safest investments there were. Europeans, the British, they all wanted a piece of the action. The Louisiana Purchase, often hailed as the greatest land transaction of all time, gave the fledgling United States double the amount of land for our ancestors to be forced to work on, because more land meant more cotton, which meant more money for the white slavers, but not for us. Now, something that doesn't get taught in American schools, though, is the United States government at that time didn't have the money to actually pay Napoleon for the Louisiana Territory. That financing was handled by a bank called Baring Brothers, a British commercial bank. As American Heritage magazine put it, technically, we didn't buy the Louisiana Purchase from Napoleon. We bought it from Baring Brothers. Baring Brothers had already made a fortune off the slave trade in the Caribbean before they turned their eyes northward. After the Louisiana Purchase, Baring Brothers vastly increased and spread their financial dealings in the U.S. Baring Brothers would make deals with slavery organizations like the Consolidated Association of the Planters of Louisiana. Baring would bundle slave mortgages, like the kind CAPL carried, into bonds, which Baring would then sell to European investors. So next time someone tells you that Britain or this or that other European power had abolished slavery, or that they didn't really practice slavery themselves, you'll know to remind them that although the British island didn't have slave plantations, the British gladly did business with everyone who did. Slavery was a global organization. It was the very genesis of globalization. Everyone wanted in because all of them were getting filthy stinking rich off of enslaving us. You didn't have to own slaves personally or even be located in the U.S. to get rich off of American slavery. The capital from these British and European banks provided the American slave owners with access to a huge pool of credit at low interest rates. They used this money to expand their evil operation, to buy more land and bring as many black people into suffering as possible. Slave mortgages were an example of a self-perpetuating criminal enterprise. The more you do it, the more lucrative it becomes, which is the more people want to do it. So understand that everybody from the sharecropper good old boy with only one or two slaves all the way up to President Jefferson was involved in slave mortgages. And just in case the slave owner was unable to pay his debts and defaulted, the bank would take possession of the slaves. Though, as we've seen for the last few hundred years, our enslavement has proved to be the most lucrative business transaction in human history. Slave bonds paid for the railroad industry. As The Economist wrote in 2013, slave capital earned at least equal returns to those from other forms of capital investment, such as railroad bonds. The rate of return on slaves could be as high as 13% compared to a yield of 6 to 8% on the railroads. And even after the Civil War, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that plantation owners who owed debts on those slave bonds still had to pay them. So these white supremacists used the enslavement and brutality against our ancestors here as a license to print money. Every big industry in this country either was directly involved in the slave trade or got their funding from companies who were. A lot of white people try to claim they didn't benefit from slavery, and many of them try to claim their families built this country, but that's a lie. Most white people in the United States can only trace their first ancestor here back to the late 19th century, 100 years after the U.S. government was established, and 2 to nearly 3 centuries after the first black people were brought as slaves to build the Americas. These white immigrants came to a land that was already built. And as we see with Wall Street and the U.S. Capitol, it was black people who built the wall and the streets. It wasn't the Irish, they weren't here yet. It wasn't the Asians, they wouldn't arrive for another nearly 200 years. It wasn't the Italians, they didn't arrive in any appreciable numbers until the 20th century. Donald Trump's family is German, but his folks didn't wash up on America's shores until the late 1880s. And yet Donald Trump, just like America itself, told the lie that New York City was largely a result of men like him and his family who built fortunes there, when the reality was they were not there with the slave markets, they were not there with the slave mortgages, or when the banks needed to be financed. They were taking advantage of wealth that other people, black people, made possible. It is the quintessential American fiction that immigrants built the country. The immigrants all came here because black people had already built it. There's a reason why the Irish immigrants fleeing the potato famine there didn't flee to Britain, didn't flee to Canada, didn't flee to Germany, didn't flee to France. All of them came here. They came here so they could enjoy the fruits of our ancestors' labors. And we've got the receipts. Now, obviously, there's a lot more to the details of how New York City in general and Wall Street in specific owes us reparations, but I think the point is made. The wealth that these companies stole from us didn't vanish, just like New York companies who became so wealthy off of our enslavement didn't vanish. The money's still there, and hell, a lot of the companies are still there. They changed names or got bought out by bigger banks, but that changes nothing. Why did those bigger banks like Chase want to buy those slave profiteering banks in the first place? Because of how much money they had. If a thief steals someone's wallet and then gives it to you, that doesn't stop it from being stolen property. So the financial sector, Wall Street, is just one filthy example of who owes us reparations. The same banks who destroyed the financial system 13 years ago also destroyed our families as well. These banks and corporations owe us, and they defaulted on that debt a long time ago. Well, as banks, they know exactly how it works when a debtor refuses to pay. The difference being our ancestors didn't deserve what happened to them. And these degenerates do. Part 2 of this series will post on next Friday. The title, I've Been Slaving on the Railroad. Good day, and be one. I'd like to take a moment to mention some of our contributors. Berto, aka Bert, Michael Johnson, Black to Deaf, Jacques Hargett, Vincent Ali, Milo Johnson, Donal Evans, Tariq Furquan, and Tavin Boone. Salute to them and thank you to everyone for listening, liking, and sharing this message. Black media only exists because of you.